When I found out he'd died in a fire, the way people use that insult, die in a fire, I had no thoughts in my head anymore. The stark, blank mind reflected nothing. Not like the meditator's mind, which I hear is reflective of the world, with sparse thoughts of its own. This emptiness was different. A different shade of void. Not void of potential at all, but numbness. Go die in a fire. It was a joke, a horrible, shocking joke that could draw gasps out of prudish mouths, but there I stood, husbandless and youthfully ancient at the prospect of my love, burnt alive until dead, and so I was numb, not empty. For when one is numb, it means she is in fact so full of thought and feeling that she shuts down at the face of processing it all. He was gone, and I was newlywed. I couldn't help but think about Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen, and that I was like Luke Skywalker if Luke Skywalker was a young married woman, in love with a gentle, generous man who died, burnt alive until dead, in a fire. I couldn't speak at the funeral. His sister did. I couldn't cry at the funeral. His brother did. I didn't feel at the funeral. Everyone else seemed to, and I had nothing anymore. The weeks that followed his death were strange. I broke. The family checked up on me, asked me what I needed, and my co-workers at the lab sent a plate of cold cuts from the deli. I'm a vegetarian, and a fruit basket. I wasn't hungry, so the fruit and meat began to rot as I thought of the flesh of my husband burned away, never a chance for him to rot. To smell sweet and fleshy, nourishing the trees, his skin nourished the fire, and the fire fed off of him. In hungry destruction, I envied the fire, its boldness, and I wanted to devour something like fire. But I couldn't even bring myself to eat a single grape from the rotting fruit basket even before it had gone rotten. Rotten smells soothed me, because aren't they a bit sweet? Isn't the decay just a bit lovely, life at its finest, dying? This wasn't my home. This was a hotel room I'd trashed, a hotel room I'd booked to grieve in because my family was far away, and his family thought maybe I should have more emotions. See, they always thought me cold. And I always was, but maybe if I were in our home, I could have been cold or wet enough to put out the fire, and he, so fiery and vibrant and broad-shouldered self, was a part of the fire, and yet, of course, a creature of earth burned to death. The hotel room of my grief had grapes and bananas smelling sweet in decay, had meat growing flies, and I put "Do Not Disturb" on the door. But I could feel the smell may start to do the disturbing in the hotel hallway, and all noses would find their way to the strange insanity of my grief. I didn't check out of the hotel, I just left. I took my fake brown leather, I'm a vegetarian, jacket, and he bought me for my birthday last year, and was mostly still numb with fascination for rotting meat and fruit, and a strange jealousy of the heat of the fire contrasted with my coldness. I left the building of the soulless, severe hotel and didn't go to my car. I didn't want my car, fuck cars. I needed to walk, for I was cold and I wanted to be warm, and when the body gets hot when it walks and doesn't stop. So I walked and didn't stop for a long time. I passed the neighborhood where our cinder ash house was, and I looked at the wreckage, burnt leftovers of home on the grass, and I kept walking. My body was cold still, and I knew more walking would need to happen. Insurance matters were taken care of by his brother, who worked for an insurance company, and I didn't have much to think about practically. I didn't care that he'd fallen asleep smoking a joint and killed himself in a fire. Whatever. Mistakes are mistakes, and I cannot condemn his drug use because he was happy, and I wasn't going to be like my mother, who condemned anyone with addictions that weren't her own, like gossip and vapid speech and fear of death. Classic addictions people find acceptable when they compare them to the oh-so-evil potheads and drinkers of the world. I didn't smoke things, but he did, and I loved him till death did us part, and I love him still, beyond the vow, beyond the empty casings of words we spoke on an altar of faith that no one really believes in. If they believed, would they not be more ecstatic? So I walked. I walked outside town, I walked and stopped at diners and tried to eat and failed at first and had a credit card and no desire to work on anything or be around anyone, and I walked so much that I was finally able to eat at one of those diners I stopped into, and it was more than damn fine coffee. I had an omelet too. Eggs, a chicken's period, a burst of potential cut short. I left the diner and my body threw up the eggs because food wasn't for me anymore. So I kept walking, and I was rained on and passed by cars and filled with my own life's smells and sweat, and I was like a sweet, rotting piece of meat drenched along the highways. I took a back road on a sunny day after I'd stopped into another diner and tried French toast, which my body rejected once again. The back road was drenched in sunlight, which began to burn, and I hoped my skin would get burnt and red and hot, and that my coldness would fade into anything but cold and blank and vomit and drive to walk. My feet felt like they hated me and began to reject my shoes in the midday sun, which fell apart like a dead fern, cracking in some places, limp in others, and my feet felt born out of the shoes, socks adhering to my feet, smells piping with raunchy life force. The sun began to burn my skin, and I thought maybe I could finally cry, finally stand in the light of day with tears, and do the emotion I was expected to have, that I expected myself to have, and I didn't. I didn't cry, I just vomited again, but my stomach was already emptied from the French toast, so all I had left was my own bile, my own thin fluids, and I hated the sun, and I envied it, because it was a fire, and it took my lover into it with devouring lust that didn't seem to be able to impart anything on my cold, empty vessel. I walked on, shoeless, hoping for a shard of glass that might bring tears of pain, the release I needed, but my feet were strong, clung to life and good instincts. I stopped instinctively before a dead bird, which beamed with life, and flies, and maggots, and regeneration. My husband's burning body fed only the fire, the air, not the earth, not life that I could see, not life that I could touch or revel in, but fed a fire that was killed by water and then gone. His body fed a temporary process, and I know we'd talked about how we both wanted to be buried, planted dead under trees together when we got old. But his bones were almost nothing, and his family insisted we awkwardly cremate him, twice burned man, my robust and laughing love, gone again by fire. I walked, and there was a graveyard, and I laughed cynically because finally my foot stepped in glass, and I needed to stop at the graveyard, wrench the glass from my foot, and maybe that shard's birth from the soles of my hardened, insane feet would surge. A surge would come up through my foot, through my leg, into me, and into my face as tears, the grieving process, would finally go through its steps. I sat at the precipice between the graveyard and the street, looking homeless for I was, and looking like death which I wish I was, and feeling like too much life, too much smell, too much vomit, too much hunger, too much wishing and hoping for feelings that never come, and too much hating the feelings we get, and too much thinking, or too little thinking. It's all just too much life. My foot bled, and I bent over to look at the blood. Red passion streaked amongst the inky black of my soul. Red life streaked along the smoky dark of my journey. Red like fire, hot pain. I didn't cry, though. I just sat, the cold observer, observing the heat of the pain and the blood from the glass. Angrily, I threw the glass across the muddled green graveyard, stones shining and dulling at me from a distance, and the glass was lost, and maybe someday someone would sit at their lover's grave and get cut right in the butt. I laughed. It was a devouring laugh of anger and of hatred for being human, everything always the opposite of what we expect, and riddled with expectations instead of presence, and anger came swiftly across my chest, and I stood strongly, robust in my brown vegan leather jacket, foe of animal products, but very authentic in life and death and living and dying within me, cells dying, cells being born, and all of them angry toward no cause at all, but humanity itself, the experience of it, the torture of it, the murk of it, the muck of it. I stormed into the graveyard, finally like fire, with no tears, no ounce of water. And I finally knew that fire is the hottest thing, and must feel like everything around it is cold, because it is on the outside as it devours. It cannot be anything but itself in a cold world, so maybe it's its own kind of fire, cold, and my thoughts dried away, logic dried away as I entered the graveyard, and there was no logic, only action. Fire is action. It goes forward and radiates around. It is action all directions, and I, like a force of nature, embodied with dryness and heat and separation from the elements around me, but feeding from the air and burning my feet along the grass and singing up the little droplets of dew that could never stand against the dissolve of my heat. I walked through the graveyard, driven by something. I didn't need to know what. Of the details, or the pain, or the future, or the past. Fire is happening in me right now, and that is all. I found myself a gravestone, and I couldn't read the carvings, the letters, the name that indicated who this pile of rotting flesh identified as in life. And I knew deeply that everything is life. That whatever was under my feet, in neatly polished facade of a coffin, was still life. It was obvious to me that this was all life, all of it, in every phase, feeding and pulsing, and that even Richard, my gorgeous, pot-smoking rebel of a husband, is alive, like everything is alive, and being the fire I saw, that time was minimally relevant, that all things may be devoured in time, and that Richard was on a fast track to nurturing the world. He was in the very air, and would always be, and had always been, for what was not alive. Standing at the stranger's grave, knowing that no one is really a stranger, because we're all just this one churning beast, I knew that in my wrecked, ugly firestorm of a state, that the stranger below my feet could be lifted from her decay of life and brought to decay in conversation with me. So I began to dig, and I dug, and I dug, and I firestormed through the dirt, an element, not a woman, whose nails sucked up the dirt. I could feel that sort of thing, that sort of glass in foot, blood on glass, vomit a few miles back from rejected French toast, all just life, like all is life, all the same. And the corpse beneath my ripped up dirty legs would speak to me. She would sing to me songs of life eternal. Sometimes your husband dies in a fire, and you walk the earth listless and given up, and you realize that you are a fire, a spark, something special. You realize that you have a lot to learn from life that is death and death that is life. You realize, or I don't know about you, but I realized I was a necromancer. And that's where my story begins.